Eleanor sat in the stillness of her cavernous living room, the silence a heavy blanket she had worn for 15 years. On the massive television screen, her husband Julian was a portrait of polished success. His suit was impossibly sharp, his smile a weapon of practiced charm, and his voice flowed like expensive wine as he spoke to the interviewer. The interviewer, a woman named Serafina with eyes that glittered with ambition, hung on his every word. Eleanor knew that look. It was the same look she had once given him a lifetime ago. "So, Julian?" Serafina purred, leaning forward so the camera caught the flattering angle of her jaw. "Apex Innovations has just posted another record-breaking quarter. You're at the top of your game. What's next for the man who has everything?" Julian chuckled, a sound engineered for boardrooms and investor calls. It lacked any real warmth. "Well, Serafina, everything is a strong word. There's always a new peak to climb, a new frontier to conquer. But lately, I've been focusing on something more personal." A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, began to crystallize in Eleanor's stomach. She had felt this dread simmering for months, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their polite, sterile marriage. She watched as Julian reached across the small table and placed his hand over Serafina's. The gesture was intimate, proprietary, and utterly devastating. It was a gesture he hadn't made toward Eleanor in a decade. Serafina's professional smile melted into something softer, something triumphant. "Oh?" she prompted, her voice a breathy whisper. "I believe in transparency," Julian announced, turning his gaze directly to the camera, as if he were looking right through the screen at Eleanor. "In business and in life. That's why I want to be the first to share our wonderful news. Serafina and I are engaged." The words cut through the atmosphere like a blade. Eleanor's breath hitched in her chest. The world seemed to tilt, the plush sofa beneath her suddenly feeling like a precipice. Engaged. He was still married to her. Serafina lifted her left hand, where a diamond the size of a small planet now sat, catching the studio lights and fracturing them into 1,000 cruel, glittering shards. The studio audience erupted into applause, but Julian wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence, a magnanimous king addressing his subjects. "I also want to take this moment to thank my soon-to-be ex-wife, Eleanor, for her years of support. We've had a long journey, but we've both agreed it's time to move on. I appreciate her understanding in making this transition as smooth and private as possible." He had framed it as a done deal, a quiet, amicable parting that she had already consented to. He had stripped her of her voice, her dignity, and her marriage on live television, reducing her to a footnote in his grand, new narrative. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. Her phone began to buzz on the table beside her, the screen lighting up with her sister's name, then her mother's. The world now knew she was the discarded wife. The pathetic, silent woman left behind. Her eyes drifted from the screen to the mantelpiece above the cold, unused fireplace. Amidst the tasteful, impersonal decor Julian had chosen, there sat a single object that was hers alone. It was a heavy, ornate brass key, tarnished with age. It was the key to a safe deposit box her father had left her. His last words to her on the matter had been etched into her memory. "Ellie, my girl, I hope you never have to use this. I hope he's the man you believe he is. But if he ever truly breaks your trust, if he ever forgets who you are, this key will remind him." For 15 years, that key had been a silent monument to a hope she had clung to with desperate futility. Now it felt like a weapon waiting to be armed. The applause from the television faded into a dull roar in her ears. He had forgotten who she was. He had just announced it to the world. It was time, she realized with a chilling, newfound clarity, to remind him. The marriage had begun like a fairy tale, or so it had seemed. Julian was a whirlwind of ambition and charm, a young executive at her father's tech firm with eyes that saw the future. Eleanor, quiet and studious, had been captivated by his energy. Her father, Harrison Vance, was a different sort of man. He was the quiet genius who had built Apex Innovations from a garage startup into a global powerhouse. He was a man of substance, not style, and he saw through Julian's polished veneer. "He's hungry, Ellie," Harrison had warned her gently, just a week before the wedding. "And a hungry man will eat whatever's put in front of him. Make sure you're the one setting the table, not the one on the menu." Eleanor had dismissed it as the overprotective worrying of a loving father. She was in love, and she believed her love could temper Julian's relentless ambition, that they could build a partnership of equals. For a few years it almost seemed possible. Julian, with his aggressive sales strategies and Harrison's revolutionary technology, pushed Apex to new heights. Eleanor was his confidant, his quiet support system, the calm anchor in his storm. Then her father got sick, a swift, cruel illness that stole his strength but not his foresight. On his deathbed he had summoned Eleanor and his most trusted lawyer, her cousin Marcus. Julian was pointedly not invited. The air in the room was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the weight of finality. "Julian will be the CEO," Harrison had rasped, his voice a shadow of its former strength. "He has the drive for it, the public face, but the soul of this company, its heart. That belongs to you, Ellie." That was when he had revealed his plan. He had spent the last year restructuring his entire estate. Publicly, Julian would inherit the title of CEO and a generous but non-controlling block of shares. But the vast majority, the controlling interest, 65% of Apex Innovations, was being placed into an ironclad private trust. A trust so discreet it was a ghost in the corporate system. The sole beneficiary and trustee of that trust was Eleanor. "He must never know," Harrison had insisted, his grip on her hand surprisingly strong. "Let him believe it is his kingdom. A man who thinks he owns the castle will take care of its walls. This power is a fail-safe, a protection. For you, and for the company I built. As long as he loves you, as long as he honors you as his partner, you will remain a silent owner. Your silence will be his shield. But if he ever betrays that trust, you become the sword." After Harrison passed, Julian stepped into the role of CEO seamlessly. He mourned publicly and lavishly, then immediately began reshaping the company in his own image. The culture of quiet innovation was replaced by one of aggressive growth and flashy marketing. He became a celebrity CEO, a darling of the financial news networks, and slowly he began to see Eleanor not as his partner, but as a relic of the old regime. She was the quiet, unassuming daughter of the founder, a living link to a past he was eager to outrun. Their dinners became silent affairs. He would talk about stock prices and market caps while she would ask about his day. He traveled constantly, always for business, returning with the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his collars and a detached politeness in his eyes. Eleanor endured it. She held on to the memory of the man he once was, and she honored her father's wish for silence. She believed, foolishly perhaps, that this was a phase, that the real Julian was still there beneath the layers of success and arrogance. Serafina's arrival on the scene had been the final, sharpest cut. She was a host on a popular business talk show, and Julian became a frequent guest, Their chemistry was obvious, a nauseating performance of flirtatious banter and mutual admiration. They were two of a kind, obsessed with status, image, and the validation of public opinion. They saw the world as a stage and everyone else as the audience. In their eyes, Eleanor wasn't even in the theatre. She was the woman who stayed home and made sure the bills were paid. They mocked her quiet nature, her love of books over parties, her preference for sincerity over spectacle. Julian had once let slip during an argument, "For God's sake, Eleanor, can't you be more exciting? Serafina understands the world I live in. You just exist in it." That was the core of it. To Julian and Serafina, she was worthless because she was not loud. Her value was invisible to them. They could never comprehend that her silence was the very foundation upon which his gaudy, celebrated world was built. The live television announcement was not just an act of infidelity, it was a declaration of her irrelevance. He hadn't even afforded her the basic courtesy of a private conversation. He had cast her aside like a corporate asset that was no longer performing. Now, sitting in the dark, the buzzing of her phone finally ceasing, Eleanor felt the years of quiet suffering coalesce into a single point of cold, hard resolve. She stood up, her movement stiff at first, then more certain. She walked to the mantelpiece and her fingers closed around the ornate brass key. It was cool to the touch, heavy with the weight of her father's last wish. She picked up her phone, ignoring the dozens of missed calls and frantic texts. She scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed in years, her cousin, Marcus, the lawyer who had been in the room when her father had given her the world in secret. He answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, I just saw, are you okay?" His voice was filled with genuine concern. "I'm fine, Marcus," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. There were no tears, no tremors, just an unnerving calm. "Actually, I'm more than fine. I need to see you. Tomorrow morning. It's time to open the box." A beat of silence on the other end of the line, and then Marcus's tone shifted from concerned cousin to sharp-witted lawyer. "I'll clear my schedule. Where and when?" "The Grand Sterling Bank, 9 o'clock, she replied. "It's time to remind Julian who I am." Julian arrived home just after midnight, striding into the house with the unearned confidence of a conquering hero. He found Eleanor in the study, not crying as he had expected, but sitting calmly in an armchair reading a book under the soft glow of a single lamp. The sight of her composure clearly unnerved him. "Eleanor," he began, loosening his tie. "Look, I know the way that came out was, abrupt." She placed a bookmark in her novel and closed it gently. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Abrupt is one word for it," she said, her voice even. He sighed, running a hand through his perfect hair. This was the part he hated, the messy, emotional fallout. It was Serafina's idea, a big public statement to control the narrative. "Get ahead of the gossip columns. It's better this way. Cleaner." "Cleaner for you, you mean?" she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "For both of us," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. He was already losing patience. "I've had my lawyers draw up a proposal. It's incredibly generous. You'll be set for life. You'll never have to worry about a thing. All I ask is that you don't make this difficult. A messy divorce would be a disaster for the company's stock. We need to present a united, dignified front." He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the coffee table between them. "Just have your lawyer look this over. It's a standard non-disclosure agreement, division of assets. Very straightforward." He spoke as if he were closing a business deal, not ending a 15-year marriage. He genuinely believed that a large enough check could purchase her silence and compliance. Eleanor looked at the portfolio, then back at him. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost impressive. He stood there, offering her a fraction of a fortune she already owned, and demanded her dignity in return. He saw her as a problem to be managed, a loose end to be tied up. The man she had once loved was well and truly gone, replaced by this cold, calculating stranger. "I will have my lawyer look it over," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. Relief washed over Julian's face. He had misread her calm as acquiescence, her silence as weakness. It was a mistake he had been making for years. "Good, that's good," he said, nodding. "I knew you'd be reasonable. Now I'll be staying at my club for a few weeks, just to give you some space while we sort this out. Serafina and I are already looking at wedding venues, something tasteful, of course. The press is already going wild." He turned to leave, his duty done, his conscience, such as it was, clear. He was already living in his bright, shiny future, with no thought for the woman he was leaving in the ruins of their past. As he reached the door, Eleanor spoke again, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "Julian," she said. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, turning back to her with an expression of mild irritation. "Do you remember my father?" she asked. The question seemed to confuse him. "Harrison? Of course I remember him. What about him?" "He always said that a man's true character isn't revealed in how he gains power," she said, her eyes boring into his, "but in how he uses it." Julian just stared at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. He didn't understand. To him it was just the meaningless platitude of a sentimental old woman. He shrugged, a gesture of complete dismissal. "Whatever, Eleanor," he muttered. And then he was gone, closing the door behind him on their marriage, their history, and, though he had no idea, his entire future. Eleanor remained seated for a long moment, the insulting settlement offer lying on the table like a challenge. She didn't even bother to open it. She already knew it was worthless. The next morning, the air in the private viewing room of the Grand Sterling Bank was cool and still. The bank itself was a relic of a bygone era, with marble floors, brass fittings, and a hushed reverence for old money. Marcus stood beside Eleanor, his presence a reassuring bulwark of legal competence. The bank manager, a severe-looking man named Mr. Abernathy, had treated Eleanor with a deference that bordered on awe, personally escorting them to the vault. "The Vance Trust box, madam," Abernathy said, using a key of his own, in tandem with Eleanor's ornate brass one. With a heavy, satisfying thud, the large metal door swung open. Inside there was a single, long, black metal box. Abernathy placed the box on the polished mahogany table in the viewing room, and then discreetly withdrew, closing the door behind him. For a moment, Eleanor just looked at it. This box contained the truth she had lived with but never touched for 15 years. It was Schrödinger's inheritance. As long as it remained closed, her life was one of quiet suffering. Once opened, everything would change. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod. "Ready?" She took a deep breath and nodded back. She lifted the heavy lid. The contents were surprisingly simple. There was no treasure, no gold bars, no jewels. There were just 2 items. On top was a thick, sealed envelope with her name written on it in her father's familiar, elegant script. Beneath it was a thick folio of documents bound in blue leather, the share certificates. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the letter. She broke the seal. The letter was dated just 2 days before her father's passing. "My dearest Ellie," it began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. The man I entrusted with my company has failed to be the man I entrusted with my daughter. I am sorry for the pain he has surely caused you. I am sorry that this burden has fallen to you. But I never for a moment doubted your strength. I only ever sought to protect your peace." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she read the familiar words of love and trust. He went on to explain his reasoning, his deep-seated belief that true leadership was about stewardship, not ownership. He had seen Julian's ambition and knew it could be a powerful engine for the company, but he also knew it lacked a moral compass. That compass, he wrote, was always you, Ellie. "These shares are not a weapon," the letter concluded. "They are a tool, a means to restore balance. Apex Innovations was built on integrity and a belief in the future. Julian has given it growth, but you hold its soul in your hands. Do with it what you feel is right. Whatever you choose, know that I am proud of you. Know that my love for you is the one asset that can never be diluted. Your loving father." She carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. Then she and Marcus turned their attention to the folio. He opened it, his lawyerly gaze sweeping over the dense legal text and official seals. He let out a low whistle. "It's even more brilliant than I remembered," Marcus murmured, his finger tracing a line on the top certificate. 65%, held in the HV Legacy Trust. Sole beneficiary Eleanor Vance. Sole trustee Eleanor Vance, with full voting rights and power of attorney, effective upon your signature on the activation clause. "What does that mean exactly?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet. Marcus looked up from the documents, a grim smile on his face. "It means, cousin, that you are, for all legal and practical purposes, Apex Innovations. The board of directors serves at your pleasure. The CEO serves at your pleasure. Julian thinks he's the king, but he's been a regent in a kingdom that has always been yours." The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't just a key to a box. It was the key to everything. Julian's power, his prestige, his celebrity, his engagement to Serafina, it was all funded by a company he didn't control, a company owned by the woman he had just publicly humiliated. The irony was so profound it was almost dizzying. His entire life was a performance staged on her silent consent. "So his job," Eleanor began, "is a gift," Marcus finished for her. "A gift you have been giving him every day for the past 15 years, and it's a gift that with a single signature you can take back." He pulled a small packet of documents from his own briefcase. "I drafted these this morning on the assumption you'd want to move forward. This first document is the trust activation. It notifies the corporate board and the SEC that you are assuming direct control as the majority shareholder. This second one, this one calls for an immediate emergency meeting of the board of directors." Eleanor looked at the documents, at the pen Marcus offered her. This was it, the moment of decision, the end of her passivity. All the years of being overlooked, of being treated as an afterthought, of swallowing her pain to keep the peace, it all led to this. She thought of Julian's smug face on the television, his condescending offer of a settlement, his utter dismissal of her feelings. She thought of her father's faith in her. She took the pen. The click, as she extended the nib, was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a sleeping giant finally awakening. "He built his throne on my silence," she said, her voice low and laced with steel. "It's time to show him the foundation is gone." Her signature on the page was clear and firm. A declaration of independence, a declaration of war. Back in Marcus's spacious minimalist office, the plan began to take shape. It was not going to be a simple, emotional outburst. Eleanor felt a cold, surgical precision settle over her. Vengeance was a messy, chaotic thing. This would be justice, orderly, systematic, and absolute. "A brute force attack is tempting," Marcus said, pacing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. "Walk in, fire him, have him escorted out. It would be satisfying. but it would also spook the market and give him the chance to play the victim to claim you're an unstable, scorned wife staging a coup. "I don't want him to play the victim," Eleanor replied, her hands clasped calmly on the conference table. "I want him to be seen for what he is, a fraud." "Exactly," Marcus agreed, pointing a finger at her. "So we dismantle him piece by piece, using the very corporate structure he worships. We make his own arrogance the instrument of his downfall." He laid out the strategy, a multi-stage operation designed for maximum impact and minimum collateral damage to the company itself. "Stage 1 is already in motion," he said, tapping the documents she had signed. "The formal notice of an emergency board meeting called by the unnamed majority shareholder. This will create chaos and uncertainty. Julian's power is built on the perception of total control. We're about to show the board that he has no control at all." "Stage 2, he continued, "is financial containment. As majority shareholder, you have the right to protect your asset. We will hire a third-party forensic accounting firm, the best in the business, to conduct an immediate audit, citing potential executive malfeasance. That gives us the legal grounds to freeze all major corporate accounts and executive expense lines, including Julian's. We cut off his money." Eleanor nodded slowly. Julian's profligate spending was legendary. Private jets, lavish parties, and, she now realized with a sickening certainty, years of expensive gifts for Serafina and others. It was all paid for by Apex. "Stage 3 is the narrative," Marcus went on, his eyes gleaming with strategic fervor. "While Julian is panicking, trying to figure out who is attacking him, we leak, not to the gossip columns, but to a serious financial journalist, someone reputable. We provide them with documented proof of Julian's use of corporate funds for personal luxuries. The trip to Monaco with Serafina last spring, the lease on her penthouse, the $500,000 consulting fee paid to her production company. We don't have to slander him, we just have to show them his receipts." "He'll be exposed as a thief," Eleanor breathed, the cold logic of it settling in. "Worse," Marcus corrected, "he'll be exposed as common, all that talk of vision and innovation, undone by a receipt for a pair of diamond earrings. The market can forgive ambition, it cannot forgive tacky, blatant fraud." "And the final stage?" she asked. "The board meeting," he said, a grim finality in his tone. "After he's been financially neutered, publicly humiliated, and his allies on the board are terrified for their own positions, you walk in, not as his wife, but as his boss, and you fire him." The plan was perfect. It was elegant, brutal, and entirely legal. It used the system against the man who thought he had mastered it. Marcus made the first call right there in the office. He dialed the number for the chairman of the board of Apex Innovations, a man named Arthur Kensington, who had been a close friend of Julian's for years. "Arthur, Marcus Thorne here," he said, his voice the epitome of professional courtesy. "I'm calling on behalf of my client, the majority shareholder of Apex Innovations. Please be advised that an emergency meeting of the board is being called for 10 a.m., the day after tomorrow. A formal notice is being delivered to your office as we speak. We look forward to seeing you there." He hung up before Kensington could sputteringly ask the obvious question. A few minutes later, Marcus's assistant confirmed that the email notifications had been sent to the entire board. The first domino had been pushed. All they had to do now was wait for it to fall. Julian was in the middle of a self-congratulatory presentation about a new product line when his phone buzzed with a high-priority email. He glanced at it, annoyed at the interruption. The subject line made him frown. "Urgent. Notice of emergency board meeting." He scoffed, assuming it was a clerical error. He, the CEO, was the one who called board meetings. He whispered to his assistant to get the corporate secretary on the line immediately. A few minutes later, she scurried back in, her face pale. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. It's legitimate. It was called by the majority shareholder. Julian's smile tightened. That's impossible. I am the largest shareholder. Apparently not, sir, she stammered. The legal notice is ironclad. It was invoked by a private trust, the H.V. Legacy Trust. H.V. Harrison Vance. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. He felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of cold dread. It couldn't be. Harrison had left him the company, hadn't he? He abruptly ended the presentation, leaving his team bewildered, and stalked back to his office, his mind racing. He spent the next hour making frantic calls. He called his brokers. They had no record of any trust holding a majority stake. He called his allies on the board. They were just as confused and panicked as he was. Who was this ghost shareholder? Was this a hostile takeover attempt he had somehow missed? The idea that he, Julian Croft, the master of the universe, could be so completely blindsided was unthinkable. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crack at the edges. His panic was interrupted by a call from a furious Serafina. "Julian, darling," she snapped, her voice stripped of its on-air sweetness. "I'm at Cartier, and your executive platinum card was just declined." "Declined? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is?" The sales manager looked at me like I was a common shoplifter. "There must be a mistake," Julian mumbled, distracted, scrolling through his emails. And then he saw it. An official memo from the CFO's office. Notice of temporary freeze on executive expense accounts, pending shareholder-mandated audit. Audit? Shareholder-mandated? The pieces were starting to click together into a picture he didn't understand, but which he knew was deeply threatening. "I'll transfer money from my personal account," he said brusquely to Serafina. "Just buy the damn ring." "This isn't about the ring, Julian," she shrieked. "It's about the optics. Our engagement is the biggest news in the city. We can't look like we're having cash flow problems. What is going on?" "I'm handling it," he yelled, and hung up on her. His authority was being challenged on all fronts. His control was slipping away like sand through his fingers. He felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since he was a young man with nothing but a cheap suit and a desperate hunger for success. The next day, the second blow landed. It was an article published on the website of the most respected financial journal in the country. The headline was devastatingly understated. Apex Innovations CEO Julian Croft faces scrutiny over extravagant corporate spending. The article, written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, was a methodical dissection of his expenses. It was filled with scanned receipts and flight manifests. The private jet to St. Bart's with Serafina, billed as a mobile strategy off-site. The $20,000 a month penthouse apartment for her, listed as corporate housing for visiting consultants. The hundreds of thousands of dollars in jewelry, couture, and spa treatments, all itemized, all charged to the company. It wasn't an attack piece, it was a cold, factual execution. It painted him not as a brilliant tycoon, but as a cheap grifter who used shareholder money to fund a sordid affair. Within an hour, #ApexEmbezzler was trending on social media. The company's stock, his pride and joy, began to plummet. From the quiet sanctuary of her father's old library, Eleanor watched it all unfold on her laptop. She saw the stock ticker glowing red. She read the scathing comments online. She felt no joy, no triumphant glee. She felt a profound cleansing sense of order being restored. The truth, which she had held silently within her for so long, was finally coming into the light. The world was finally seeing Julian not as the icon he pretended to be, but as the hollow man he truly was. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "The board members are in a full-blown panic," he reported, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Kensington is calling for Julian's head. His allies have evaporated. They're terrified the audit will uncover their own complicity. The stage is set, Eleanor. Tomorrow, you take it. The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Apex Tower was a cathedral of corporate power. A long, black granite table reflected the grey, overcast sky visible through the panoramic windows. The dozen board members were assembled, a collection of grim, anxious faces. They avoided making eye contact with Julian, who sat at the head of the table, his face ashen, his usual swagger completely gone. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in 2 days. He had spent the last 24 hours in a desperate, failed attempt at damage control. He had issued denials that no one believed. He had tried to rally support from a board that now saw him as radioactive. He was isolated, cornered, and utterly baffled. He still had no idea who was pulling the strings. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. At precisely 10:01, the heavy glass doors to the boardroom swung open. Eleanor walked in. She was not the woman they remembered from awkward company holiday parties. The quiet, mousy wife who faded into the background was gone. In her place was a figure of immense poise and authority. She wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that spoke of power, not fashion. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her expression was one of serene, unshakable resolve. She was flanked by Marcus, who carried a slim leather briefcase. A collective gasp went through the room. Of all the possibilities the board had considered, a rival corporation, a hedge fund activist, a foreign government, this was the one thing none of them had ever imagined. Julian stared, his mouth literally hanging open, his face cycled through a series of emotions: utter disbelief, confusion, dawning horror, and finally, sputtering rage. "Eleanor," he choked out, his voice cracking, "what in God's name are you doing here? This is a private meeting. Security!" 2 burly security guards, who had been standing by the door, took a step forward. "That will not be necessary," Marcus said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension in the room. He stepped forward and placed a single, bound document on the table in front of Arthur Kensington. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce you. You are addressing Eleanor Vance, the sole trustee and beneficiary of the HV Legacy Trust, which holds 65% of the voting shares of this company. You are addressing the majority shareholder, and, as of this moment, the new chairwoman of the board of Apex Innovations." A stunned silence fell over the room. Kensington fumbled with the document, his eyes scanning the legal language, his face growing paler with every line he read. He looked up, first at Marcus, then at Eleanor, his expression one of complete capitulation. It was all there. It was all real. Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane! It's a trick! She forged these documents! She's a nobody! Tell them, Arthur! Tell them this is ridiculous!" But Arthur Kensington simply slid the document down the table. "It's all verified, Julian. It's real." Eleanor finally looked at Julian. Her gaze was not filled with hatred or anger. It was cold, distant, and utterly dismissive, as if she were looking at a faulty piece of equipment that needed to be replaced. She walked slowly to the head of the table, forcing him to take a step back. She remained standing as she addressed him, her voice filling the silent room. "You spent 15 years treating me like a decorative object," she began, her tone even and measured. "A quiet placeholder in your life. You mocked my simplicity. You despised my silence. You thought my silence was weakness, a sign of my worthlessness." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But what you didn't know, what you were too arrogant and self-absorbed to ever even consider, was that my silence was your crown.
My silence was your career. My silence was the only thing holding up this entire, glittering, fraudulent world you built for yourself. Her voice grew stronger, each word a hammer blow to his shattered ego. My father, a man whose name you are not worthy to speak, saw the truth of you from the very beginning. He saw your ambition, but he also saw the rot in your character. So he gave you the role of CEO, a stage on which to perform, but he gave me the company, he gave me the power, he trusted me to be its guardian. The blood drained from Julian's face. He looked around the table, seeking an ally, a friendly face, but found only the cold, judgmental stares of men scrambling to save themselves. His empire had crumbled in less than 5 minutes.
And today, Eleanor concluded, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than all his years of shouting, I am revoking your privileges. That was when he finally broke. The carefully constructed facade of Julian Croft, titan of industry, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the screaming, terrified child beneath. You can't do this, he shrieked, his voice pitching high with hysteria. I built this company. Me! You did nothing. You sat at home and read your stupid books while I made this company what it is. You ungrateful. His tirade was cut short as the boardroom doors opened again. Serafina swept in, dressed for a television appearance, a practiced look of concerned support on her face. She had come to stand by her man in his moment of crisis, a perfect photo opportunity. She stopped dead, taking in the scene. Julian, red-faced and screaming. Eleanor, standing at the head of the table, like a queen, and a room full of stony-faced executives.
What's going on? She asked, her voice faltering. Julian whirled on her, his rage needing a new target. You! This is your fault, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at her. You and your stupid obsession with going public. Control the narrative, you said. You pushed me into this. You ruined me. Serafina's face went from confusion to horror as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. The power, the money, the status, it wasn't his, it was hers. The discarded, boring wife owned everything. Her $1 million ring suddenly felt like a cheap piece of glass. Eleanor watched the pathetic, ugly scene with detached calm. She had no more words for him. She turned to the board. My first act as chairwoman, she announced with quiet authority, is to accept Julian Croft's immediate resignation.
My second is to authorize the forensic auditors to expand their investigation into a full 5-year review of all executive activity and to turn over any evidence of criminal wrongdoing to the proper authorities. Security will now escort Mr. Croft from the building. He is to be denied any further access to company property. The 2 guards, who had been waiting, stepped forward and took Julian by the arms. He sputtered, trying to struggle, but his fight was gone. He was a deflated balloon, all hot air and no substance. As they led him away, a broken, ranting mess, Eleanor did not grant him the dignity of a final look. She simply took her rightful seat at the head of the table. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Arthur Kensington cleared his throat. Welcome, Madam Chairwoman, he said, his voice filled with a newfound, profound respect. What are your orders? The aftermath was swift and brutal. The forensic audit uncovered a staggering level of embezzlement and fraud. Julian had been using Apex Innovations as his personal piggy bank for years. The evidence was so overwhelming that the district attorney's office filed criminal charges within weeks. Stripped of his wealth and prestige, he was a pariah. His so-called friends abandoned him. Serafina, after a single, disastrous television interview where she tried to paint herself as another of Julian's victims, saw her show cancelled. She vanished from the public eye, her 15 minutes of fame ending in disgrace. Julian Croft, the man who once graced the covers of business magazines, was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in a state prison for felony, grand larceny, and securities fraud. His last public image was a grainy photo of him in an orange jumpsuit, his face pale and defeated. He had lost everything because he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. He thought it was about noise, but he learned too late that it was about substance. Eleanor, in contrast, thrived. Taking the helm of Apex Innovations, she proved to be her father's daughter in every way that mattered. She eschewed the spotlight, declining interviews and focusing on the work. She dismantled Julian's culture of flash and greed and reinvested heavily in research and development, steering the company back to its core mission of genuine innovation. The stock, after its initial dip, rebounded and soared to new heights under her quiet, steady leadership. The employees, who had chafed under Julian's tyrannical reign, now worked with a renewed sense of purpose. She did not move into his ostentatious office. Instead, she worked from her father's old, more modest office, which she had kept preserved exactly as he had left it. She sold the corporate jet, the fleet of luxury cars, and the penthouse apartment. With the proceeds and a significant portion of her own revitalized fortune, she did something Julian would never have conceived of. She established the Harrison Vance Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing scholarships and seed funding for brilliant young engineers and innovators from underprivileged backgrounds. Her life was no longer silent, but it was quiet. It was filled with purpose rather than drama. One afternoon, several months after taking over, she was touring a new R&D facility funded by her foundation. She was listening intently as a young lead engineer explained a breakthrough in renewable energy technology. He was brilliant, passionate, and spoke about his work with a humility that reminded her of her father. He paused, noticing her focused attention. "I'm sorry, Madam Chairwoman, am I being too technical?" Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Not at all," she said. "Please, call me Eleanor, and what you're doing is not just technical, it's important." He smiled back, a warm, respectful smile that held no artifice. His name was David, and in his eyes she saw not a reflection of her status or her wealth, but an appreciation for her mind and her spirit. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one built not on a hidden truth, but on a shared one. A final scene shows Eleanor months later, standing on the observation deck of the Apex Tower, looking out at the city lights. She was no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage, but the master of her own destiny. True power, she now understood, was not in what we display for the world to see, but in the quiet integrity of the foundation upon which we build our lives. True wealth wasn't measured in stock prices or sensational headlines, but in the peaceful, steady rhythm of a life lived with purpose and honor. Julian had spent his life chasing a glittering illusion, while she had quietly inherited the unshakable truth. The noise had faded, and in the silence she had finally found her voice.